Hello, everyone. I just wanted to welcome you to our Regional Housing Partnership Developer Needs Assessment findings. And this presentation will be recorded and will be provided at our Regional Housing Partnership website, which is kcrhp.org. So you'll be able to find that later. And also we'll be sending this out to some of our partners and those who participated as well. So I will go ahead now and turn it over to Kim Keaton and Christina Duran, who are consultants with CSH, who've put together this assessment, and they'll be doing the presentation today. So I will pass it over to you, Kim and Christina. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm Christina Duran. I'm a senior program manager with CSH on our national consulting team, and super excited to work on this project with my colleague Kim, who I'll let introduce herself, and then we'll jump into the study.
Hi, everybody. Kim Keaton. I'm a director of data and analytics at CSH, and I am located actually locally in Kansas City, Missouri. Great to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm not a Kansas City native, but I am in the neighboring state up in Iowa. So down in Kansas City often. So next slide, please. There we go. Sorry about that. So for this study, this is the LISC Developer Assessment Study, and we had the opportunity to meet with many of the folks in the development community to assess the housing needs and what it would take to get developers, for-profit developers, not-for-profits, CDCs, PHAs, just to get everyone involved and see what we can do collaboratively to try and get some more units online, what those gaps are, and what type of incentives could be offered, or what type of programs could be offered to help with some of the barriers that exist in Kansas City in getting those affordable units developed. We know that there are some challenges. We heard from many of you. And one thing I will say and applaud, Kansas City definitely does not hold its tongue. We heard from a lot of developers and got some really, really good, honest feedback, and just really got a great sense that people want to be part of the solution. And so that was really inspiring to be in a space with folks that are that passionate. And so what this study looked at is the purpose of it. It is to look at, create an assessment report and provide recommendations for a pilot program that could help break down some of the barriers that affordable housing, to get more affordable housing units online, and what incentives could be offered to developers to help make that happen. And so the project objectives support the Regional Housing Partnership's goals of creating affordable housing, address development and resiliency opportunities, and also with all of the work that we did and all of the work that CSH does overall, make sure that we're embedding racial equity in those regional affordable housing strategies. Okay. Next slide. Developer assessment study included 3 different components. So there was some work that was done a couple of years ago that was also spoke to developers to see, kind of just get an environmental scan on where things were. And so we were able to look at the interviews that were done back then, and also looked at the notes from those interviews, who also had talked to some of the same people that we talked to this time. So that was really interesting to be able to look at how things have either changed or stayed the same over time in certain areas. And then also just looking at environmental scans of the area to see like what's trending, what are some of the barriers that are specific to Kansas City versus nationwide, and also looking at how folks have kind of troubleshot those barriers. Then we also, the bulk of the study was meeting with stakeholders. And so we held several focus groups that we met with public housing authority individuals, and then we had one-on-one interviews. We also set up multiple focus groups to just make sure that we were having really organic discussions with folks on what's going well, but also what are some of the barriers and what possible solutions could be created to help people get to a closing much faster. We also put together an online survey so that we could, it wasn't possible for us to meet with everyone. So this gave others an opportunity to give their feedback. And so we were able to engage with people in that way as well. And then we had a focus group with people with lived expertise to understand what some of the barriers are to just finding affordable housing and what that experience is. And then after that, we collected all of that information, went back and came up with some recommendations that we're happy to share with you.
So there has been significant work done by Regional Housing Partnership and Mark's Housing Data Hub, as well as, I should say, individual counties within the Regional Housing Partnership area, to look at what is the actual gap and, you know, sort of assess the numbers part of this. And we're not going to spend too much time on this, but the most recent analysis by Mark's Housing Data Hub found a regional gap of 64,000 affordable units. These are really focused at the very low income and extremely low income level. So those are folks that are making 30% or less than the KC Metro's area median income. And so that's, it's a large portion of that gap. It's about 45,000 units are for units that should be affordable to that people making that much money. There is a phenomenon called crowding out that actually makes contributes to the affordable deficit. And that's where people who can afford higher rents, so they're not very low or extremely low income tenants, but they are occupying those affordable units, resulting in fewer affordable units for households who really need them. So what this means is that our extremely low income folks are getting crowded out of the affordable units and therefore are living in homes that are unaffordable to them. And that's usually defined as spending more than 30% and often more than 50% of your income on rent. So we did, as I'm not going to go too much into this because Christina kind of just talked about it, but over the course of our stakeholder engagement, we engaged with over 100 folks around the region. We were intentional in trying to ensure racial and gender diversity, a range of development experience. So experienced developers and newer interested developers, as well as along other sort of parts of the sort of housing development industry. And we tried for geographic representation across the greater Kansas City region. So I am going to talk about the results of our survey first, and then you'll hear from Christina about the results of our one-on-one interviews and themes from our focus groups. So we had 39 respondents that returned the online survey. Many respondents had worked on developments, whether affordable and or market rate or mixed use in the counties. We didn't have respondents that had experience in 4 of the 9 counties. Most folks had some type of experience, and when they had experience, had some type of experience in Jackson County, followed by Wyandotte, Wyandotte, Clay, Johnson, and then Leavenworth. And not all respondents had were exactly aligned with having done development. Some were like government folks or folks that are not necessarily involved at the individual unit level. The types of folks that responded to the survey, you can see here about half were actual developers or community development corporations or community groups, followed by some property managers, planners, contractors, finance folks, real estate, a couple government folks, as I said, and then housing service providers and architects. Many people fit into many buckets, wear many hats. And so that's why you see a lot more different types here. People could select more than one role for themselves. So we try to get a sense as well of the types of developments and financing mechanisms used by folks for affordable housing. And so you can see on the left, the financing mechanisms are, tax credits are mostly probably LIHTC, as well as private financing. Again, as folks tend to know, developing affordable housing often takes many kinds of financing, so people were allowed to select more than one here. There were also a significant amount of groups that had received county or city house type funding, and which includes housing trust fund monies. There were a good number receiving federal, for example, continuum of care type of funding to fund probably, usually rental subsidies and things like that. And then there were some that had stacked some CDFI products like pre-development loans and whatnot on there, and others that had received some state non-LIHTC type funding, CCED funding, and then a few examples of cash, no financing, as well as one tax abatement example. The types of developments folks are doing are largely concentrated, over half, in smaller multifamily dwellings, and then townhome or multiplex structures. I was surprised to see how many examples of developers had done single family developments. And then we had a number 8 that had done supportive housing. So that's housing with services for, usually people who experience homelessness at the very, very lowest income and high need spectrum of need. So just a few examples of larger multifamilies, which seems pretty typical for our region. We had a few of the newer model of tiny homes developers, as well as, one mixed use and one single family example that used the Urban Homestead Act. And I'm going to turn it over to Christina to intro the one-on-one interviews.
Okay, thank you. So we had, as I mentioned before, we ran one-on-one interviews. And Andrea, I'm not able to turn my video on, but we had one-on-one interviews. We met with 10 different developers or folks that, not just developers, we met with some folks that just touched the affordable housing world. So we talked to some investors, bankers, and architects, folks on the for-profit, not-for-profit side, CDCs. And so we had a really good mix of folks we weren't able to get someone from all 9 regions, but we definitely were able to speak to people in our one-on-one interviews that have had business dealings in all 9 interviews. So we feel like we got a really good geographic perspective. Also made sure that we were very inclusive, racially inclusive, as well as geographically inclusive for the folks that we had reached out to. And next slide, please, Kim. And so within those one-on-one interviews and the focus groups that we had, we held 4 focus groups with developers, 1 with the Public Housing Authority individuals, and then another with people with lived expertise. We were able to put the feedback into kind of 6 buckets of common themes for barriers to development in the region. And so those buckets are financial barriers, I don't think that comes to anyone's surprise. I heard a lot of just lack of pre-development capital operating funds, service funding, particularly for smaller developers or emerging developers that don't have access to funding in the same way that larger developers do, maybe because of lack of experience or just not having that strong balance sheet. Then the second most common was government and process. So really just getting stuck along the way, complicated, kind of archaic government processes. And also just having, a lot of people had commented that post-COVID, just having less municipal staff available also contributed to the kind of slowdown. So it's one, not having access to answer questions, but then also just the additional time that it takes to process. Next was really community and public outreach, just a disconnect between folks that are trying to develop affordable housing, and so trying to reach out and have a more collaborative approach. And also looking at neighborhoods, not just in building a building and building housing, but also looking at neighborhood revitalization and how the landscape looks in neighborhoods that need more than just housing. They need an uplift on many other economic pieces. Then we heard a lot of education and training needs. Challenges in that training and education are necessary, but also heard that the capacity for staff, especially in smaller offices, to have people out of the office to go for training and go take classes and get that experience, but definitely an appetite for it. So we heard that. Also, not just from an academic standpoint, but folks are looking for practical experience and some practical ways to get their hands in on particularly troubleshooting issues that come up in real estate development. And then, of course, construction costs, as we all know, have skyrocketed and continue to go up. So it was one, just the overall costs of construction and how it's increasing, but also how the lack of being able to access skilled trades has really impacted the costs, either through having to pay more, just supply and demand, to get folks on the job, or just the waiting time that it takes to be able to secure subs in those skilled trades. And then lastly was market factors. So looking at things here, there was a lot of discussion about non-local developers that were purchasing properties and then not developing right away. And just some of those challenges, as well as challenges with the appraisal process and how that looks in some neighborhoods where there weren't comps that would allow property to be valued at the proper value. And so that led to less borrowing power, as well as in Black and brown neighborhoods, that the valuation of properties also not having that equal value. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. And so out of those findings, we had categorized, really found that there were really three main themes, three things that really seemed to touch just about every single stakeholder that we met with. And it really came down to time, money, and vision. Money, just not having enough available, enough access, but even all of those barrier components that we talked about, time is money. And so how do you get to a closing table faster? How do you, all of those components, that what happens when you find that you've got cars buried in your lot that you weren't aware were there? How do you access money to address those kind of issues? And hearing from folks that it is difficult to get those flexible funds to even keep operations up and running while you're waiting for equity to come in. And so really just hearing from people that there are challenges on just keeping the business afloat in an industry that sometimes can be unpredictable. So that timing, and then something that I think was not a surprise to me, but I think rang through louder than I had anticipated, and was pleasantly surprised, was just the the discussion points around vision for neighborhoods. And I think that it was particularly rang true in predominantly BIPOC neighborhoods, where there is a very strong sense of pride and history and wanting to make sure that that comes through, and that there is a vision and economic development is happening for the neighborhood overall, and making sure that, you know, neighborhoods are not just providing housing, but that they're also thriving and, you know, have a path forward for education, for businesses, and just overall economic development. Okay. And next slide. So then from this, we went and said, well, what do we've heard from folks. So what do we think would be helpful? And in all of the focus groups, we asked that pointed question, like, what do you need? And so we took that back and paired it up with the feedback that we received through the one-on-one interviews, focus groups, the online survey, as well as the historical information that we had looked at, and came up with kind of 3-4 buckets of, you know, folks really were looking for education and training, resources, funding, and then partnership opportunities. Next slide. And so what we've done, I'm going to cover the 5 that we're recommending, but we also have 9 or 10 others here that will be provided folks in the slides or in the just for time purposes. We'll go ahead and just focus on the top ones. So first, we thought that it would be very beneficial to folks, and was something that we heard from nearly everyone, to be able to have a flexible fund that offered pre-development loan money, specifically for emerging and smaller developers, to help with pre-development costs, and making these funds available to developers that wouldn't be able to likely access traditional funds, or even traditional CDFI funds, making it so that it is much more flexible regarding the experience that's needed and balance sheets and other areas. And the more flexible that it needs to be, maybe more intense TA being offered for that, just to help, again, with that emerging developer getting up to speed on some of the pieces of the business. And along with that, also hearing a lot from folks that it's just needing money during the process, right? So how do you keep the lights on in the office while you're waiting for, you know, an equity payment to come in? And so setting up some type of flexible funding line of credit, so that developers can access that to pay for third-party reports or things that are just kind of part of the normal process, but also keeping the business afloat. Next was really thinking about partnerships and how we can partner with communities to help people through the process. And from that, we heard one, that it was difficult to get a hold of anyone in the municipalities to ask questions, and also that there was a lot of kind of ambiguity around application processes and applications themselves. And so coming up with a program where an application liaison or some comparable person would be available to help review and proofread funding applications that go in, to cut down on errors or consistency, or to help understand the process a bit better. So obviously we're talking about a large region with a lot of different municipalities, but this person could get up to speed on what scoring criteria is, making sure that when applications are submitted, that all of the proper documentation is there. So just offering support in that sense to help with that process. And then to address the, next slide, sorry. To address the education and training, we also thought that it would be helpful to set up a training series that was multiple sessions, but where it focused in the beginning kind of on affordable housing 101, but then also making it so that the students in the class could determine what their learning gaps or what their knowledge gaps were, And then the second portion of the class could really be built around what those knowledge gaps are. So it's not just a pre-established curriculum, but could actually be built out and customized to the folks that are in it, so that can get a good base knowledge, but then also, wherever there are known knowledge gaps, have the curriculum geared towards that. And then the second piece to that would be providing a kind of master class where students would take what they learned in the first session and apply it to a case study that would be mirrored towards a real housing development that's would be riddled with trouble, so that you could really apply what was learned, and also just practical ways to troubleshoot some of the common real estate developments hurdles and barriers that are out there, just to give folks
Christina, we lost you there for a second. While she figures out her audio issues, we had talked about actually pausing right here to see if folks had any questions. As she said, we've just gone through our priority recommendations, and then we have another a list of just sort of other types of recommendations that may be interesting to look at.
And feel free to put any of your questions in the chat. It should be open for you to share those.
Okay. Oh, it apparently says the chat is disabled.
Oh no.
We have one attendee. Are they allowed? I'm going to allow Marvin to talk, and maybe he could just say his question verbally.
Oh. Yeah, that would be great.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Marvin.
Hello. Thanks again for sharing. So actually, I was just, well, the question that I have, I see a lot of the recommendations here, and I think these are great recommendations. Are there any recommendations that are specific to Black economic development or Black real estate development? And I say this because when you look at the lack of access or the lack of inclusion historically and even presently for Black developers, it would appear that we need a very specific solution for this community, as there has been a very specific exclusion of this community. And so I didn't see that here. Maybe that's coming up in the other suggestions, but wanted to just give you a moment to speak to that.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the question. That's super important, as you point out. So while the education and training pieces, I think, well, it doesn't actually say that here. That is pointedly for building capacity in the developer space. So that could be seen as one of the options that would be focused on building capacity and expertise for Black BIPOC developers. And then right here, the flexible revolving line of credit. This is also particularly for smaller and emerging developers, which includes neighborhood-based and BIPOC developers. With the, one of the things we heard, Marvin, was that as an emerging developer, it's hard to break into the space because you either have to partner with a larger one, therefore reducing profits for all developers, or your application gets all the way, you don't have enough experience to pass all the requirements of even the application. And so this would be a way for small and emerging developers, many of whom are BIPOC, to have access to a more lenient underwriting and experience standards, and have access to flexible funding sources to help with some of those barriers that they already have. So those are a couple of them. And I don't know if my colleague Christina was able to come back or not.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry about that. We have some fire activity on my block, so something's going on
gosh.
with
Okay.
our internet. Yes. But thank you, Kim, for filling in on that. So we did have some other recommendations that are available in the report, but wanted to pause and see if there are any questions or any comments that folks had.
And you might have missed that one, Christina. That was Marvin asking a question about any of the recommendations geared towards BIPOC developers. And I
Yes.
pointed out that the training and flexible loan fund would be key, but I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to that question.
Yep, I think that is, I think all of these recommendations were certainly made with BIPOC developers and emerging developers, which we understand are we've got many established BIPOC developers, but many of the folks that we had heard from were smaller BIPOC and emerging developers, and so we feel that these recommendations would really be helpful in those firms.
Did you have another question, Marvin? Okay, I wasn't sure if your hand was up or not. Just pointing out too that there was a question in the Q&A section around goals pertaining to outcomes, number of units per year to be produced. I think the implementation of these recommendations is where that sort of thing will be handled. And Andrea, you probably want to add to that.
Yeah, and I did answer John in that we'll be working with sort of the larger regional housing partnership strategy committee and other stakeholders to identify goals and objectives out of not just these findings, but findings from other studies and assessments that we've been doing over the last year to 2 years. And so we'll be collecting all of that to determine what the next steps are and, what goals can be created from those. We did have another question from Commissioner Hanslick. She was asking, were financial barriers or government process/policies identified as the greatest barrier, or were these two factors relatively equal?
I think that the message that rang clear the most was the financing piece. But they were definitely there was a connection there because the lag in time to get through the government processes and approvals certainly added the cost to the projects and to the developers, and just made it so that some of these deals just don't pencil out the right way if they're taking an exorbitant amount of time to get through the process and having to then secure additional capital money just to cover the timing on it. So I would say that the financing is what really rang true, but rang the loudest and the most often, but it was really hard to separate the two of them.
Good question, though. Thank you for asking it.
And I don't see any other questions in the Q&A box. Were there any other questions before we move forward? Oh, Commissioner Hanslick said thank you.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, folks. I think we can then briefly go through the other recommendations if there's time for that, or should we just wrap up? Andrea, I'll follow your lead on that.
Yeah. And Marvin had left another question about, he appreciates the answer, but want to be very specific of addressing the issues of BIPOC developers. And like we've discussed, we're going to be delving more deeply. This is just basic information that we've gathered and that we're sharing, and we'll be doing more deep dives with those who participated, as well as other stakeholders and people within the region working on housing, as well as cities, to identify more specific programming as we move forward. So thank you all for your questions, and I will keep a lookout for them, but we can go ahead and move forward with the rest of the presentation.
All right, how are we doing on time, Andrew? Do you want us to cover the other?
Yes, she does, I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
Perfect. So additional thing that folks were looking for or found to be confusing was just the amount of information that's out there, but not in one consolidated place, particularly on funding. The funding calendars can be very tricky, and it's hard to know what you don't know. And so recommendations is a fairly simple one, but just to put together a comprehensive funding matrix that has an interactive calendar that would allow developers to have like a one-stop shop for funding information, and be able to visualize when those applications are due, so that they're able to kind of build that capital stack in their mind as they're putting together their application timelines. Next slide. And some of these others, so Fresh Start funding. We heard from several that there are a good number of properties that have significant title arrears, or other types of arrears, whether they're utility arrears or others. And then projects where there are significant site preparation issues. And so being able to provide, one was pushing for an advocacy to just have those titles cleared or the arrears cleared prior to the developer taking on the project, so that that cost isn't passed along to the developer and the project. But in the meantime, creating a funding source that would help offset the cost of clearing those. Next is providing, there were developers that were interested in expanding their geographic footprint for their portfolios. And so providing a fund that would allow for that to happen by providing grant money to kind of do assessments, also just get their foot in the door in other areas that have been determined to have a greater need, and not have units being produced at the rate needed. Then also just putting together a resource that's a troubleshooting database for developers. Talked a lot about how the wheel gets recreated many times, just because developers aren't always in the same space to be able to network and talk about how they've troubleshot certain things that have come up. And so really this is more of a networking tool for developers to just be able to share, so that they can cut down again on that time it takes to get to the closing table, so that they can cut costs. Kim, I'll let you talk a little bit about the PHA workshop, since you had done that focus group.
Sure, yeah. We had a group of leaders from 4 different regional housing authorities, Leavenworth, Johnson County, KCK, and KCMO. And they resonated, their issues resonated with a lot of the other developers as far as unit availability, etc. Not on the slide here, I just want to say they particularly pointed out the issue of LIHTC properties that are sort of aging out of their 30-year period, and the need to keep those in the affordable housing stock and not let them go market rate. But one pilot program recommendation on this list that we had was just, it didn't seem like the housing authorities might benefit from a more regional partnership and network with each other. I think when you look at the data on affordable housing need and gap, some counties really have very little, and other counties have a very deep lack of affordability. And so, you know, really creating formalized working groups among regional PHAs to improve voucher utilization across the region and reduce barriers to access for low income voucher holders, as well as really, you know, create a formalized guidebook, you know, to implement best practices for PHAs across the region. I think just from a national perspective, HUD has been, you know, involved with recently issuing some more, you know, encouraging PHAs to reduce their, for example, criminal background history checks and things like that. And, you know, we feel like something like this could be a model nationally for a regional partnership to partner across public housing authorities.
Great, thank you, Kim. Next slide, please. We'll go through these quickly just for time purpose. Also looking at just how do we engage the next generation of developers coming in and make sure that we're providing a path to get them excited, but also to teach them the ropes. And so coming up with a young developers mentoring program that could provide some dollars for the mentee, but also provide some dollars for the developer to help with some capacity building. And along those same lines is also providing or connecting people who are interested in skilled trades, or coming up with some kind of marketing so that we can get folks interested in skilled trades, and then making sure that they are connected to professionals in that trade, so that they can get some type of, there's the education piece, but also doing some shadowing and getting a feel for what the job actually is before committing to a program, and also just to kind of get that awareness out there and try to build up the skilled trades in the area. Again, tying it back to the funding and the construction costs that we heard from everyone are rising. And then also creating local jurisdiction networking groups. So this could be something that we have municipalities give feedback to a centralized person who then puts together a guidebook of common challenges, so that folks, when they're going in for an application round, could look in that and see, well, what are the common things that either get an application rejected or are less likely to be funded. So really just using it as a guide to help people score better, get funding faster. A lot of the municipalities have one funding round a year. And so if you miss that funding opportunity because of an error, or because, lack of understanding something, it really does have strong implications. And so this kind of support would be very helpful to developers. And then lastly, providing grants for looking at that neighborhood beautification and economic development of entire neighborhood, themes that we had heard from folks. And this would be providing grants to help beautify neighborhoods, either through community gardens or murals, or working with local artists who can come and add some kind of artistic component or beautification component to a project to again build up neighborhoods. So those were the some of these are definitely pilot program. Others are just recommendations of good practices that we feel would be helpful to communities, just to be able to again hit all of those areas that we heard from developers that are creating those barriers. Kim?
And I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the last slide. I think John has a hand raised, but we'll go ahead and do this last slide just to remind folks of our key pilot program recommendations. And so those were what you see here. Identify liaisons to streamline local, this is the housing application liaison, to streamline those processes. The second one is the affordable housing masterclass. So combining a focused learning series to develop capacity in affordable housing development with student-driven course content, and then a master class on which is a deep dive on developing a project. And then finally, the pre-development funding and flexible credit with two-tiered loans to pre-development loans that are two-tiered to have more flexibility and reduce barriers to entry for newer developers, including BIPOC or Black developers. And then a flexible line of credit to help cover costs during the life cycle of the development related to delays, delays in payments, delays in approvals, unexpected issues that come up. All right. Do we have any more questions? Okay, we have one additional question right here. Commissioner Hanslick, are there any jurisdictions that already have application liaisons or housing development training? I can answer part of that. I will say that Kansas City, Missouri has participated in something called a Supportive Housing Institute that CSH has managed. That includes affordable and supportive housing. So there have been those opportunities. And there will be another one in 2024. That's really focused on the supportive side of things though. Andrea?
And we do know of a couple organizations within the region that do provide some smaller scale training. And so we will again be looking at how do we lift up that work that's already being done and allow those programs to maybe grow in what they're already doing, because we don't want to reinvent anything. We just want to support the programs that are out there and how we can get them to the scale that's needed by what we heard from the developers. Marvin, I did see your comment in the Q&A section, and I just want to let you know that we'll be taking that into account, definitely moving forward. Yes, and Commissioner Hanslick with not reinventing the wheel. Yes, this is the point where we take this information and dive into it more deeply and figure out what the best programs are for our community moving forward and how we are intentional about what we're doing in that work. Do we have any other questions?